In 1964, Lenny Bruce was arrested for obscenity in New York City, following a performance at Café Au Go-Go in Greenwich Village. The trial that followed lasted several months and became the most closely watched legal proceeding in the history of American comedy. Norman Mailer, Allen Ginsberg, Bob Dylan, and dozens of other cultural figures signed petitions in support of Bruce. The judge convicted him anyway. George Carlin was 27 years old that year. He was doing safe television comedy. He was wearing a suit. He followed the trial carefully. What he was watching was not just a legal case. He was watching a demonstration, a precise, public, carefully documented demonstration of what the machinery of institutional opposition could do to a comedian who decided that nothing was off-limits. Bruce had been the first American comedian to understand that the prohibition on certain subjects in comedy was itself a subject worth examining, that the culture's insistence on keeping certain topics, race, religion, sex, the gap between American mythology and American practice, out of the comedian's purview was not a neutral preference, but a form of control. He had decided to examine those topics anyway, and the result was a career that was, for a few extraordinary years in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the most vital thing happening in American comedy. Then the arrests started. San Francisco, 1961. Chicago, 1962. Los Angeles, 1962. Each arrest was an obscenity charge, and each charge was based on the specific language and the specific topics that Bruce refused to remove from his act. The legal cases consumed his time and his money, and gradually, his ability to perform. Clubs stopped booking him because the risk of prosecution was too high. Promoters stopped promoting him for the same reason. By the time the New York trial began in 1964, he was already operating in a significantly diminished professional landscape. The trial made it worse. Carlin watched this from close range. He was in the same professional world, the clubs, the television appearances, the circuit that connected comedians across the country. He knew Bruce's work. He admired it with the specific admiration of someone who recognized in it a quality of precision and courage that he had not yet found in his own work, but that he understood as something worth pursuing. The trial made clear what the pursuit would cost. Bruce was convicted on 3 counts of obscenity in November 1964. He was sentenced to 4 months in a workhouse. He appealed, and the appeal process occupied the last 2 years of his life, consuming the attention and the creative energy that might otherwise have gone into work. He performed sporadically during those years, in the few places that would still have him, increasingly consumed by the legal documentation of his own case. He died in August 1966, 2 years after the conviction, before the appeal was resolved. Carlin was at the funeral. He stood with a small number of people willing to be counted in public as mourners. He had watched the trial, watched the deterioration, and was now watching the end result of what the legal campaign had done to a man who had simply refused to stop. The lesson that some people took from Bruce's fate was that the cost was too high, that the correct response to the evidence of what institutional opposition could do was to be more careful about the targets you chose, that the space of permissible comedy was bounded by real consequences, and that staying within those bounds was the rational strategy for a working comedian who needed to continue working. This was not the lesson Carlin took. What he took was more specific and more useful than a general principle about the limits of acceptable speech. He took a technical lesson, a lesson about the mechanisms of opposition and where they were most effective and where they could be circumvented. Bruce had been prosecuted largely for his language. The specific words he used, in specific contexts, were the surface that the law could grip. Carlin understood that the surface was not the thing. The surface was a vulnerability. The thing underneath the surface, the argument, the observation, the challenge to the official version, could be delivered with different language in ways that made the legal surface harder to grip without abandoning the substance. He spent the next 8 years developing exactly this. The transformation of the early 1970 seconds, the new act, the new material, the willingness to say things that The Tonight Show could no longer accommodate, was built on a foundation that included what he had watched happen to Bruce. Not as a warning, as a blueprint for how to do it differently. He was more precise than Bruce had been, more structurally rigorous, more attentive to the relationship between form and content, to the way that the architecture of an argument could carry the challenge while making the language harder to prosecute. He was still arrested in Milwaukee in 1972. The charges were still dismissed. The FCC still brought the 7 words case to the Supreme Court. Institutional opposition was not something that could be entirely avoided by being more careful about the surface. But the pattern of his encounters with opposition was different from Bruce's. Less personally consuming, less career-ending, less fatal. He kept working. In 2003, New York Governor George Pataki granted a posthumous pardon to Lenny Bruce. The conviction that had contributed to his death was officially expunged from the record 37 years after the fact. Carlin had been part of the advocacy effort that produced the pardon. He spoke about it with satisfaction, though the satisfaction was complicated. It was the satisfaction of a correct outcome arriving too late to matter to the person it was supposed to vindicate. Bruce had been convicted in 1964. The pardon came in 2003. The gap between those two dates is the measure of how slowly the official version of a culture catches up to what its most honest voices already knew. George Carlin watched the trial in 1964. He watched the funeral in 1966. He waited until 1972 and then stepped onto a stage and did what he had been watching someone else pay for the right to do. He knew the cost. He had watched it tallied in real time. He went anyway. The difference between Carlin and Bruce was not courage. Both had courage. The difference was craft, the specific technical skill of delivering a challenge in a form that was harder to destroy. Bruce had the truth. Carlin had the truth and the architecture to protect it. He built that architecture on the evidence of what he had watched happen to a man who had the truth and nothing else. It was enough to watch. It was enough to learn from. It was enough to build on.